On the night of August 16, immediately after President Ashraf Ghani left the country and the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan effectively ceased to exist, ceding power to the Taliban, a military transport plane landed at Kabul airport. On board were Afghan Special Operations Commandos who had arrived from Kandahar, a city located about 500 kilometers south of the capital and the heart of a province that many considered a stronghold of the Taliban movement. Despite this, from mid-July and throughout the entire month, Afghan commandos stubbornly held their defenses in Kandahar, finding themselves completely surrounded. Their resistance proved so fierce that the Taliban were unable to break through to the city center or capture the Kandahar airport. It was only on August 15, upon learning of the fall of the central government in Kabul, that the Special Forces ceased fighting. The Special Operations Command organized their evacuation by transport plane, and the fighters left Kandahar undefeated, without laying down their arms. The defense of Kandahar stood in stark contrast to the rapid collapse of Kabul's defenses. This was no accident. Afghan Special Forces units were considered the most combat-ready in the entire country's army. They were distinguished by their high level of training, modern weapons, motivation, and vast combat experience. Although American instructors played a significant role in their creation, the command structure of the Afghan Special Forces had deeper roots. In 2021, the Special Operations Command was headed by General Mohammad Farid Ahmadi, a 1987 graduate of the Ryazan Guard's Higher Airborne Command School. Back in the late 1980s, as a young lieutenant, he commanded a platoon in an Afghan commando battalion that fought side by side with Soviet paratroopers and GRU Special Forces. Undoubtedly, the successes of the Afghan Special Forces were largely due to such officers, who had been trained in the Soviet military and hardened in real combat. The experience of interacting with Soviet Special Forces left a deep mark on the biographies of many Afghan officers. It is characteristic that General Ahmad, already commander of modern units created with U.S. support, always proudly wore the Old Medal for Bravery on his dress uniform, an award established by the Soviet government of Afghanistan and presented to him in the late 1980s. This medal reminded him of his youth and his first battles, long before the dramatic events in Kandahar and Kabul. In 2011, American Special Forces carried out an operation to eliminate Osama bin Laden, an event that became perhaps the most famous targeted elimination ever carried out by Special Forces. For the U.S. and its allies, it became a symbol of the triumph of the concept of precision operations for targeted killings. However, as sensational as this story may be, it was not the first and far from the only one. There were classic examples of similar missions before it, and one of the most famous operations of this kind was Storm-333, the legendary storming of Amin's palace in December 1979. This operation, inextricably linked to the Afghan War and Soviet Special Forces, occupies a special place in the history of Special Forces. So much so that even decades later, NATO soldiers in Afghanistan considered it an honor to be photographed against the backdrop of the ruins of that very palace, which had become a symbol of the determination and strength of the Soviet Special Forces. It turns out that the key milestones of the American era in Afghanistan, from the elimination of bin Laden in 2011 to the hasty withdrawal of NATO troops in 2021, involuntarily refer us to the experience of Soviet operations, in particular the storming of Amin's palace. It is from this action that the beginning of the war, which lasted for decades and ended only in 2021, is usually counted. Nevertheless, it would be simplistic to consider Storm-333 the real beginning of the conflict. Afghanistan had long been in a state of political instability and civil strife by that time, and the introduction of Soviet troops was just another stage in a long chain of bloody events. To understand the origins of this war, we need to rewind history at least a few decades. Among the common stereotypes about Afghanistan, one statement stands out: no one has ever been able to conquer Afghanistan. This phrase, which has become almost a cliché, actually has little to do with historical reality. The same is true of the popular opinion today that Afghanistan is a key region of the planet and the center of world geopolitics. In reality, this country was indeed important in ancient times and the Middle Ages, when its territory was crossed by the most important trade routes of the Great Silk Road. Contrary to the common myth that Afghanistan has never been conquered by anyone, historical reality tells a different story. Throughout history, its lands have been conquered by anyone who managed to reach this region. The ancient Persians left their mark here, Alexander the Great came here with his armies. Later Arab conquerors spread Islam. Tamerlane passed through these lands, and in the 18th century, they were shaken by the campaigns of Nader Shah. By the 19th century, the situation had changed. Afghanistan had lost its former importance as part of the trade routes and had become a backward periphery, torn apart by constant internecine wars between local emirs who controlled different provinces. From an economic point of view, the country was no longer of great interest to potential invaders. But it had a new and very powerful neighbor, the British Empire. By this time, Britain had finally established control over the vast territories of modern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. This entire region, known as British India, became the jewel in the crown and the most important source of income for the metropolis. It was the security of the northern borders of this richest possession that was of paramount importance to London. And although Afghanistan itself, poor, inaccessible, torn by internal conflicts, did not particularly appeal to the British as a potential colony, it was of vital strategic importance as a buffer state. Britain's policy in the region boiled down to creating, by any means necessary, a government in Afghanistan that was oriented toward London and ready to ensure the stability of its borders. But this was extremely difficult to achieve. In the early 19th century, Afghanistan was in a state of almost continuous war for supreme power. Dynasties and emirs succeeded one another on the throne. At the beginning of the century, power belonged to Emir Shuja, who was oriented towards the British and considered their ally. However, another round of power struggles led to his overthrow, and Shuja Shah was forced to flee to India under the protection of his British patrons. Meanwhile, Dost Muhammad, an energetic ruler who was in no hurry to enter into an alliance with London, established himself in Kabul. The British, as usual, immediately offered him an alliance, but Dost Muhammad proved to be smarter. He preferred to wait, hoping that another great power would appear on the horizon, ready to offer more favorable terms. By the middle of the 19th century, the Russian Empire, which was growing in strength, was becoming the second key player in Central Asia, alongside the British Empire. This could not fail to alarm London. Britain feared that Russia's advance southward would one day threaten the jewel in the crown, India. It was in this context that the events of 1837 unfolded, when the Emir of Afghanistan, Dost Muhammad, received a Russian diplomatic mission. For the British, this was a wake-up call. In response, the British remembered the deposed Shuja Shah, an old ally of London, who was in India, and decided to use force to return him to the throne. In 1839, a military invasion began, which went down in history as the First Anglo-Afghan War. At first, everything went in favor of the British. They easily captured Kabul, and Dost Muhammad was forced to flee to the mountains. Shuja Shah, who was pro-British, was indeed restored to the throne. However, he was unable to hold on to power. By the end of 1841, a large-scale uprising had broken out against the puppet emir. This time, Shuja Shah was unable to escape and was killed. The British garrison remaining in Kabul found itself trapped. In January 1842, the troops began a difficult retreat across the snow-covered Afghan passes under continuous attack from the mountain tribes. It was then that the most famous episode of this war took place, the tragic Battle of Gandamak. The retreating units were virtually destroyed. Only one British doctor, Dr. William Bridden, survived and managed to reach Jalalabad. It is often claimed that a 16,000-strong army left Kabul and only one person survived. In reality, things were somewhat different. Indeed, a column of about 16,000 people left Kabul, but the lion's share of this number were civilians, families, servants, and carters. The actual troops in the column numbered about 4,500, of whom about 700 were British soldiers, the rest being Indian units recruited in Bengal. Despite this, the defeat came as a shock to the British and went down in history as one of the heaviest blows to the colonial army. However, the story did not end there. A few months later, Britain organized a second expedition. In 1842, Kabul was again occupied by the British. This time, they acted much more harshly. All those involved in the rebellion were publicly executed. As a result, London managed to negotiate with Dost Muhammad, the very man whose overthrow had been the reason for the war. The British restored him to the throne, but now on conditions of complete loyalty to the British. In 1863, after the death of Dost Muhammad, The Afghan throne was inherited by his son, Sher Ali. It was during his reign that Afghanistan found itself in an even more difficult situation. The growing Russian Empire approached the northern borders of the country and, as a result of its expansion in Central Asia, occupied Khiva, Bokhara, and Kokand. Now, only a narrow layer remained between Russian possessions and British India, Afghanistan, which had effectively been turned into a buffer state. For London, the situation looked threatening. The British feared that Russia, using Afghan territory, would one day strike at the British Crown's main treasure, India. Moscow, for its part, had no desire to capture Afghanistan, understanding its poverty, backwardness, and fragmentation, but it also did not want to see British agents there. As a result, Afghanistan became the object of constant pressure and rivalry between the two empires. Neither side wanted to directly seize the country, but both sought to make it their ally and, in essence, a satellite. Thus began an era of complex diplomatic intrigues, behind-the-scenes games, and covert confrontation, known as the Great Game. It was the maneuvers within this game that ultimately led to the Second Anglo-Afghan War. By 1878, the international situation had sharply deteriorated. Russia had defeated the Ottoman Empire, advanced into the Balkans, and nearly occupied Constantinople, which provoked fierce resistance from Britain. At this point, St. Petersburg decided to increase pressure on London through Afghanistan and sent a diplomatic mission headed by General Stoletov to Kabul. Sher Ali showed favor toward Russia and effectively refused to accept the British mission, which London regarded as a threat to its interests. Fearing that Afghanistan would finally fall under Russian influence, Great Britain organized a new invasion at the end of 1878. Thus began the Second Anglo-Afghan War. For Afghanistan, its consequences were far more devastating than those of the First War. Sher Ali was unable to hold on to power and left the country just 1 month after the British invasion began. He was succeeded by his son, who, after a series of defeats, was forced to agree to extremely humiliating peace terms. Thus, in the village of Gandamak, known for the tragic battle for the British 45 years earlier, the Gandamak Treaty was signed. Under its terms, Afghanistan renounced its independent foreign policy and undertook to follow exclusively the course set by London. In return, the British promised to pay the Emirate 600,000 rupees annually, essentially a subsidy for loyalty. Moreover, Afghanistan ceded a number of border territories to British India. Later, in 1893, these concessions were legally enshrined in the so-called Durand Line, named after the British diplomat. This border became a real tragedy for the country, as it divided the largest ethnic group in the region, the Pashtun. Now their lands were divided. Some Pashtun tribes remained part of Afghanistan, while others fell under the jurisdiction of British India. For London, this was a strategic success. The colony became more reliably protected. But for Afghanistan, this division turned into a serious problem, the consequences of which are still felt in the 21st century. For the next 40 years, Afghanistan remained completely in line with British foreign policy, losing the ability to maneuver independently. At the same time, the country entered the 20th century just as poor and backward as ever. The emir's power remained limited. Each new heir to the throne faced infighting among the tribal nobility, literacy among the population did not exceed a few percent, and the Islamic clergy wielded enormous influence. Women were deprived of their rights, medicine was almost non-existent, and many ancient traditions, including marriages with minors, continued to exist unchanged. In fact, half of the state budget consisted of British subsidies. But the world around them was changing rapidly. Japan was making a leap towards modernization, and the Ottoman Empire was undergoing reforms by the Young Turks. In Afghanistan, similar ideas began to be promoted by the so-called Young Afghans. Their most famous representative was the young Emir Amanullah Khan, who ascended the throne in 1919 at the age of only 26. Amanullah proved to be an energetic, educated, and ambitious leader who dreamed of turning Afghanistan into a modern, independent, and strong state. Almost immediately after coming to power, he declared the country's complete independence, including the right to pursue an independent foreign policy. The second important goal was to resolve the Pashtun question. The emir was determined to return the territories inhabited by the Pashtun but cut off by the Durand Line to Kabul's control. In the same year, 1919, the Afghan army crossed the border and invaded British India, counting on the support of local Pashtun tribes. In the early days, the troops were successful and even captured several towns, but soon the British, with their technical and organizational superiority, seized the initiative and defeated the Afghans, after which they themselves invaded their territory. Realizing the futility of further resistance, Amanullah requested peace. The short but fierce Third Anglo-Afghan War ended in the same year. Britain recognized Afghanistan's full independence, but the Durand Line remained, and the return of the Pashtun lands had to be forgotten. The British also stopped their annual subsidies, depriving the emirate of half of its former budget. However, the young emir did not lose heart. Having achieved the main thing, recognition of the country's sovereignty, he immediately turned to his northern neighbor, the newly formed Soviet Union. Under Amanullah's leadership, Afghanistan became the first state to recognize the Soviet government. In return, he hoped to receive weapons, equipment, and technology necessary for the rapid modernization of the army and the entire state. At that time, the Soviet Union was engaged in a fierce struggle with the Basmachi, who, after their defeats in Central Asia, were increasingly retreating to Afghanistan, using it as a safe haven. That is why Moscow was interested in an alliance with Amanullah Khan. In exchange for his support in the fight against the Basmachi, the USSR was ready to provide the country with weapons, equipment, and resources for modernization. Amanullah's plans were truly ambitious. In 1923, he gave Afghanistan its first constitution in history, and in 1926, he abolished the old title of emir and proclaimed himself the first king of Afghanistan. His goal was to destroy the remnants of feudalism, limit the power of the tribal aristocracy and Islamic clergy, and build a modern secular state. He announced the introduction of universal education for the entire population, including women, which sounded revolutionary for Afghanistan at that time. The king also stopped paying the mullahs their traditional allowances from the treasury in an effort to separate religion from the state. To find the funds for his reforms, Amanullah raised taxes on large landowners, hoping to use their money to accelerate modernization. But these measures met with fierce resistance. The majority of the population was illiterate and got all their news from sermons in mosques. Deprived of state funding, the mullahs quickly found common ground with the discontented feudal lords, who were burdened with new taxes. Together, they began to convince the people that the king had allegedly betrayed Islam, was destroying centuries-old foundations, prohibiting traditional marriages with underage girls, and imposing alien, godless orders. In 1928, these sentiments erupted into a large-scale uprising. It was led by Habibullah Kalakani, a deserter from the Afghan army and a charismatic leader who quickly gained the support of numerous Basmachi. In exchange for their support, Kalakani promised not to restrict their freedom to operate from Afghan territory and to continue raids on Soviet lands. Amanullah Khan, realizing the seriousness of the situation, turned to the Soviet Union for military assistance. However, Moscow was in no hurry to get directly involved in Afghan affairs at that time. Nevertheless, in early 1929, the situation changed dramatically. Kalakani overthrew Amanullah, occupied Kabul, and proclaimed himself the new emir. The consequences were not long in coming. Soon, a large detachment of Basmachi, with the support of the new regime, invaded Soviet Tajikistan and even captured the city of Garm. Only after fierce fighting did the Red Army manage to drive them back, but after retreating, they again took refuge in Afghanistan under Kalakani's protection. Then the Kremlin finally realized that the rise to power of radical forces in a neighboring country posed a direct threat to the Soviet borders. The Politburo openly stated, "The victory of the reactionaries will have dire consequences. It will pose a serious threat to the security of our republics. The main task is to support any government capable of continuing the progressive course and fighting for Afghanistan's independence." But by that time, Amanullah Khan had already lost real power. He fled to the south of the country, trying to gather supporters and continue the struggle, but with each passing day his influence waned, territories came under the control of the rebels, and the number of soldiers loyal to him rapidly declined. In these circumstances, the Soviet leadership, realizing the threat posed by radical forces on its borders, finally decided to intervene and provide direct military support to the legitimate monarch of Afghanistan. Thus began the first Soviet intervention in this country. Not in 1979, as is commonly remembered, but back in 1929. This episode is little known to the general public, but it was largely responsible for the Kremlin's decisions half a century later. On April 15, 1929, a detachment of about 2,000 cavalrymen, supported by 4 cannons and 22 machine guns, crossed the Soviet-Afghan border. Of these, approximately 1,800 were regular Red Army soldiers, while the rest were Afghans who remained loyal to King Amanullah. The operation was top secret. Soviet soldiers operated under false names and formally did not exist there. The task was clear: to help Amanullah return to the throne and restore order in Kabul. At first, the campaign was successful. The Soviet-Afghan detachment captured Mazar-i-Sharif and Balkh. But the expedition was unable to change the overall course of events. By that time, Amanullah had lost almost all of his supporters, did not wait for the arrival of the Allied forces, and, having seized as much money as he could carry, left the country. He never returned to Afghanistan. Thus ended the first attempt to modernize the state by force and with the support of the USSR. After the king's flight, the presence of the Soviet contingent in Afghanistan lost all meaning. Soon, the Red Army returned to the territory of the Union. And within the country itself, another bloody redistribution of power began. Habibullah Kalakani, nicknamed Sajdush, held the throne for only 9 months before being overthrown and executed by former Defense Minister Mohammad Nadir Shah. The new ruler reigned for 4 years and was assassinated in 1933. The throne was inherited by his 19-year-old son, Mohammad Zahir Shah. He was destined to rule Afghanistan for more than 40 years, longer than any other monarch in the country in the 20th century. This period, from the 1930s to the 1970s, is considered the most stable time in modern Afghan history. Stable, of course, relative to the continuous coups and uprisings that the country experienced before and after. Zahir Shah, like Amanullah before him, received a Western education and had a modern mindset. He understood the need for gradual modernization, but learned from the fate of his predecessor: no drastic reforms, no open attacks on the foundations of society. All changes were carried out cautiously and gradually. In the 1930s, the country's first university was established, a careful expansion of universal education began, the compulsory wearing of the burqa was abolished, and a parliament and a regular army based on conscription were created. In foreign policy, Afghanistan stayed out of world conflicts, maintaining smooth relations with all its neighbors. During World War II, the country managed to remain neutral. It was a convenient partner for the USSR. The new government expelled the Basmachi, depriving them of their base for raids. By that time, Britain understood that nothing threatened India's northern borders. For decades, Afghanistan ceased to be the subject of major geopolitical rivalry. It was of interest only to its immediate neighbors, and only in the context of border security. However, as is often the case in history, deep contradictions lay hidden behind long years of external calm. Afghan society remained conservative and traditional, with reforms affecting only the upper echelons. And when the period of relative stability ended in the 1970s, the accumulated contradictions came to the surface in the form of new coups and bloody turmoil. It is noteworthy that all this time, alongside the young king, there was a much stronger and more influential figure, a man who effectively directed Afghanistan's domestic and foreign policy, remaining in the shadows but exerting a decisive influence on the fate of the country. This influential figure was Muhammad Daud, the cousin of King Zahir Shah, his loyal ally and supporter of the idea of transforming Afghanistan into a modern, centralized, and secular state. Daud, like many members of the ruling elite of the time, was educated abroad and chose a military career. He graduated from a military academy in France and, upon returning to his homeland, quickly rose through the ranks. By the 1930s, he had become a general and headed the Central Army Corps, a key unit of the Afghan army responsible for Kabul. However, his influence extended far beyond his formal position. In fact, Daud was at the forefront of the formation of the country's modern army. It was he who began the mechanization of the armed forces. In 1939, Afghanistan purchased 300 trucks and 180 artillery pieces manufactured by the Czech company Skoda from Nazi Germany. All this was done just a few months before the start of World War II. In order not to spoil relations with Great Britain, the Afghan leadership simultaneously purchased aircraft and laid the foundation for the creation of its own air force. The opportunity to test the new army in action arose in 1944, when a major tribal uprising broke out in the country. Daud led the suppression of the rebellion, which saw the first large-scale use of the Afghan Air Force. The success of the operation greatly increased his authority, and he soon took key positions in the government, becoming Minister of the Interior and then Minister of Defense. In 1953, he became Prime Minister of Afghanistan. Formally, he was second only to the king, but in reality, it was Daud who determined the country's political course, increasingly pushing his cousin out of real power. In 1947, a turning point for the entire region occurred. British India collapsed, and a new state, Pakistan, emerged on its territory. Now it became Afghanistan's closest neighbor. For Daud, this opened up a chance to correct a historical injustice, to return the Pashtun lands, once cut off by the Durand Line, to Afghanistan's control. In 1950, Afghan troops even invaded the border territories, but after a week of fighting, they were repelled by the Pakistani army. This episode convinced Daud that the army needed a major modernization. At first, he tried to enlist the support of the United States, but Washington was actively building an alliance with Pakistan at the time and refused to provide military aid to Kabul. Daud then turned to the Soviet Union. In 1956, an agreement was signed under which Afghanistan received T-34-85 tanks from the USSR, and later T-54 and T-55 tanks, MiG-17 fighters, and Katyusha multiple rocket launchers. The most important element of cooperation was the program to train Afghan officers in Soviet military schools. During Daud's premiership, about 4,000 Afghan military specialists were trained in the USSR. In addition to the army, cooperation extended to engineers, doctors, and students. The Soviet Union built schools, roads, and hospitals, and the influence of socialist ideas in Afghanistan grew rapidly. It was at this time, under the influence of the Soviet model, that the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, was created in 1965. At first, it was a small organization with only a few thousand members, mainly intellectuals and officers. The party was led by writer and journalist Nur Muhammad Taraki. Soon, a faction led by Babrak Karmal, a member of parliament, formed within the PDPA. Thus, the first communist party in Afghanistan, oriented directly towards Moscow and its ideology, appeared. On the one hand, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seemed a natural opponent to the monarchical regime, but on the other hand, at that moment, the relations between the king and Daud with the Soviet Union were too important to spoil them because of repression against the communists. Therefore, the authorities left the party virtually untouched, and the PDPA itself remained a small organization in the 1960s, staying on the periphery of the country's political life. The main center of power continued to be Muhammad Daud, whose influence was growing. In 1963, King Zahir Shah, fearing the rapid rise of his relative, dismissed Daud. However, the monarch lacked Daud's talent, authority, and political will. And in 1973, when Zahir Shah was abroad on a visit to Italy, Daud easily organized a military coup, relying on the army, where he was highly respected. The king officially abdicated and remained in Italy, while Muhammad Daud became the absolute ruler of the country. He abolished the monarchy, proclaimed Afghanistan a republic, and concentrated the posts of prime minister, defense minister, and foreign minister in his own hands. Soon, a one-party system was introduced under the control of a party created by Daud himself. As a politician with 40 years of experience who came to power as a result of a coup, Daud was determined not to repeat the mistakes of his predecessors. Almost immediately, he began a large-scale purge of the elite. Over 100 politicians, businessmen, and military personnel, including former Prime Minister Mohammad Mewandwal, were arrested or executed. In the following years of his rule, the press regularly published reports about the uncovering of new conspiracies and the arrests of opposition figures. Gradually, Daud's regime began to resemble the dictatorships of Middle Eastern leaders such as Saddam Hussein. The new ruler's foreign policy was flexible and duplicitous. He skillfully maneuvered between the USSR and the US, adeptly exploiting their contradictions. On the one hand, Daud assured Moscow that Afghanistan would not allow foreign military bases on its territory, which completely suited the Soviet leadership. On the other hand, he actively developed trade and economic ties with Iran and Saudi Arabia, the closest allies of the US in the region. The only direction in which Daud was unable to establish stable relations was Pakistan. The Durand Line, the internationally recognized border between the two countries, remained a stumbling block. The Afghan authorities did not recognize it then and still do not recognize it now, considering the Pashtun lands beyond the line to be historically Afghan. Daud did not give up on his dream of returning these territories and changed his tactics in the 1960s. Instead of open combat, he began to wage a guerrilla war on the border, sending Afghan Special Forces units there with the task of raising an uprising among the Pashtun. King Zahir Shah did not support this strategy and dismissed Daud because of it. But when Daud himself overthrew the monarch in 1973 and became a dictator, alarm bells rang again in Pakistan. Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto decided to launch a full-scale hybrid war against Kabul. In essence, Islamabad began to use the same methods that Daud had previously used against them, but in a more thoughtful and systematic way. The official goal of the campaign was to overthrow the Daud regime and bring to power in Afghanistan a government friendly to Pakistan that would never lay claim to Pashtun territories. Pakistan's decision to actively intervene in Afghanistan's internal affairs was made back in 1975. Since then, for almost half a century, this strategy has been implemented without interruption. Neither the USSR, nor the US, nor even NATO were as consistently and deeply involved in Afghan events as Pakistan. Therefore, when you hear sensational stories about the great world chess game that the leading powers are playing in Afghanistan, it is worth remembering a simple truth. Pakistan has been the main and only truly interested player in this region for the past 50 years. And what is the most effective way to destabilize a regime in a country where, by the 1970s, 92% of men and 95% of women were illiterate, and over 40% of the population lived in poverty? The answer was obvious. Use the ideas of Islamic fundamentalism and jihad. And Pakistan had all the necessary tools for this. The country had a huge army, powerful special services, and military coups and rule by generals were commonplace. The state ideology itself was based on Islamism. Alongside the usual courts, Pakistan had a system of Sharia justice. It was logical that the bet was placed on the radical Afghan Islamist opposition. Muhammad Daud, who was building a secular dictatorship, openly antagonized the clergy, traditionally one of the most influential forces in Afghanistan. The leaders of the religious opposition fled to Pakistan, where they came under the protection of the Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, a special service with a reputation as one of the strongest in the world. There, training camps were set up for them, they were armed, trained, and sent back across the border to fight against the Daud regime. Ideological work among the recruits was carried out by activists from the ultra-right Pakistani party Jamaat-e-Islami. In 1973, a 20-year-old man from Afghanistan who dreamed of becoming a mujahideen arrived at such a camp. This young man quickly demonstrated leadership qualities and an amazing aptitude for military affairs. His successes were so significant that the Pakistanis appointed him as an instructor for other militants. His name was Ahmad Shah Massoud. In 1975, Massoud was already involved in the first serious uprising against Daud. A detachment trained in Pakistan invaded the Panjshir Valley. But the attempt was unsuccessful. The Afghan army suppressed the rebellion, Massoud was shot in the leg and miraculously managed to escape, returning to Pakistan. Thus began the civil war in Afghanistan, even before the communists came to power and several years before the Soviet troops were deployed. After the failure in Panjshir, the Pakistani secret services moved on to a new phase. In 1975 to 1976, they created the Islamic Party of Afghanistan, Hezb-i Islami, headed by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the most radical Islamists of his time. Hekmatyar became Islamabad's main protege in Afghanistan until the 1990s, when the Pakistanis found a replacement for him in the form of even more radical figures, now known throughout the world. Nevertheless, Hekmatyar's Islamic Party was not the only force. Ahmad Shah Massoud continued the struggle, but under the banner of the Islamic Society of Afghanistan, which was considered more moderate. However, despite differences in slogans and tactics, all these movements, both radical and relatively moderate, were supplied with weapons, finances, and instructors by Pakistani intelligence. Thus, while Daud was fighting the Islamists in Afghanistan, a third significant political force remained on the sidelines. the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA. After coming to power, Daoud practically ignored the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. In terms of numbers, it was far inferior to Islamist movements. By 1977, it had about 18,000 members. However, its main advantage was not quantity but quality. Over 2,000 officers of the Afghan army were members of the party. These were not low-level people. Many had been trained in the USSR, had military experience, and carried weight among their colleagues. Daoud understood that under the officially proclaimed one-party system, the PDPA would sooner or later become a target for destruction. Tensions between the government and the party were growing, and all it took was a spark to ignite the explosion. It flared up on April 17, 1978, when one of the prominent party leaders, Mir Akbar Khyber, was killed in Kabul. It was never established who was behind the murder, but his funeral on April 19 turned into a rally attended by thousands of people. About 30,000 people took to the streets with slogans against the arbitrariness of the authorities, accusations against Daoud, and calls for democracy. Feeling supported, the PDPA called on the residents of Kabul to come out for a new demonstration on May 1. It is important to note that, despite its relative small size on a national scale, the party had a strong position in the capital. Its core consisted of students, intellectuals, and officers, and it was in Kabul that their main strength was concentrated. On April 24, Daoud convened a meeting with the Minister of Defense, the Minister of the Interior, and U.S. Ambassador Theodore Elliott. The American diplomat, as a representative of the stronghold of democracy, advised not to stand on ceremony, to arrest the leaders of the PDPA and ban the party. The ministers supported this idea. Daoud, who at that moment was taking steps toward the U.S. and preparing to sign trade agreements worth $500 million, decided that the time was right to strike a blow against the communists. He was confident that the Soviet Union would turn a blind eye. After all, Daoud continued to purchase all his weapons exclusively from the USSR, remained an exclusive customer, and therefore could afford to take the risk. An experienced politician, he reasoned cynically and pragmatically. Secure his own regime, please the Americans, and at the same time not fall out completely with Moscow. This was reminiscent of Saddam Hussein's style, who skillfully maneuvered between the superpowers while ruthlessly cracking down on communists at home. However, Daoud did not take one thing into account: the determination of the PDPA members themselves. More than 2,000 officers were not going to wait quietly for their punishment. On the night of April 26, 1978, on the orders of the president, more than 500 people were arrested in Kabul. Key members of the party, including its leaders Nur Muhammad Taraki and Babrak Karmal. In the morning, the radio announced that a conspiracy against the state had been uncovered. It seemed that the fate of the PDPA had been sealed. Those arrested awaited trial and execution, and the party was doomed to disappear. But at that moment, a man who had not been talked about very often came to the fore: Hafizullah Amin. He was not one of the main leaders, but as a member of the PDPA Central Committee, he was the highest-ranking party member who had not been arrested. It was he who, on the morning of April 26, managed to convey the order to 22 officers to start an armed uprising. On April 27, these officers distributed the order among their units. Many Democratic officers did not even know that an uprising was planned for that day. Nevertheless, on the morning of April 27, tank units of the 4th and 15th Brigades brought armored vehicles onto the streets of Kabul and moved towards the presidential palace. The rebels were supported by the Air Force, led by Colonel Abdur Qadir. The tankers seized the Kabul radio building and the Ministry of the Interior, but encountered fierce resistance from the Presidential Guard, numbering about 2,000 men with their own armored vehicles. The first attempt to take the palace failed, 2 infantry fighting vehicles were destroyed, and the rebels retreated. This delay allowed the Ministers of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff, who were loyal to Daoud, to leave for the headquarters of the Central Army Corps in Tajbek Palace to organize resistance. It was Tajbek Palace that became the center for organizing resistance to the April uprising. Built in the 1920s on the orders of King Amanullah in European style, it was located about 10 kilometers from Kabul, on a hill. Although the monarch's official residence was in Kabul itself, Tajbek was used as the headquarters of the Central Army Corps, which was in fact the country's main military district responsible for defending the capital. This unit was of particular importance in the Afghan army, and it was here that Daud himself began his career in the 1930s. The first assault on Tajbek began on April 27, 1978, when the rebel Air Force launched an air strike on the palace. However, they were unable to take it immediately. The next day, on the morning of April 28, the assault resumed, and soon the palace fell into the hands of the rebels. The Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff tried to escape, but were captured and shot. On the same day, the rebels occupied the prison and freed the arrested leaders of the PDPA. Daud's last stronghold was his presidential palace in Kabul. On April 27, his guards repelled several attacks, but the situation changed dramatically the very next day. Among the officers defending the palace were members of the PDPA. When they realized that they were fighting not against Islamic radicals, but against their own party comrades, some of the defenders defected to the rebels. In the end, only a small group of Daud's closest associates remained with him. On the morning of April 28, the rebels' negotiator, Senior Lieutenant Imamuddin, entered the residence with an offer to lay down arms. But Daud responded by personally shooting him, wounding the officer. This was followed by a barrage of fire, and the president himself, along with his entire entourage, was killed. Thus, power in Afghanistan passed to the People's Democratic Party, an event that no one could have predicted just a day earlier. The April Revolution was not a premeditated conspiracy, but rather a forced reaction by party officers to the threat of reprisals. The entire initiative belonged to a small circle of military personnel, 24 officers and Hafizullah Amin, for whom this uprising became his moment of glory. A few days later, the Kabul Times newspaper published a list of the new government. After PDPA General Secretary Nur Muhammad Taraki and his deputy Babrak Karmal, Amin was listed as the third most important figure. This came as a complete surprise to the Soviet leadership. In his memoirs, the future head of the KGB, Vladimir Kryukov, who headed foreign intelligence in 1978, recalled that Moscow had normal working relations with Daud. The new leaders, who called themselves communists and declared friendship with the USSR, were almost unknown to the Kremlin. To assess their potential, Kryukov personally met with Taraki and other leaders. His impressions were mixed. According to the intelligence officer, the conversation with Taraki left a heavy feeling. The new president's words sounded like a mixture of revolutionary romanticism and naive optimism, behind which lay complete political inexperience. Taraki assured him that the PDPA, having carried out the revolution, had been historically right, while Moscow, with its skepticism, had been wrong. He claimed that everything the Soviet Union had achieved in 60 years, Afghanistan would be able to achieve in 5. Particularly noteworthy was his answer to a question about the future of Islam in the country. "Come back in a year, and you will see that our mosques are empty." Taraki's statement alone that, in a year, the mosques will be empty, was enough for experienced analysts to conclude that the new regime in Afghanistan was doomed. As Kryukov recalled, as early as 1978, Soviet intelligence gave an extremely clear assessment of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, and its prospects. The reasons for such skepticism lay primarily in the very structure of the party and its personnel. Kryukov noted that the April coup did indeed have the characteristics of a revolutionary event, but the broad masses did not participate in it. It was more of a conspiracy by a small group of military personnel acting without a clear program or a clear understanding of how to build a new society. Among the participants of the NDP, there were many naive and inexperienced people who acted more on the basis of emotion than sober calculation. Some pursued purely career interests, while others displayed traits of adventurers. In addition, the party itself suffered from division from the moment it was founded. Almost immediately, the NDP split into two factions, the radical Halk, People, and the more moderate Parkham, Banner. Formally, they reunited a year before the April Revolution, but in reality remained two competing political forces. After the coup, Nur Muhammad Taraki, a representative of the Khalq, became president, and Babrak Karmal of the Parkham became his deputy. But the real revolution was organized by Khalq officers led by Hafizullah Amin, and Amin's supporters did not understand why their leader, the hero of the coup, was overshadowed by Karmal. Amin's ambitions were enormous. no less than those of the previously deposed Daoud. Just a few months after the new government was established, he initiated an internal purge aimed at eliminating Parkham and its leaders. In August 1978, the exposure of a large-scale conspiracy by revolutionaries and imperialists was announced. As usual, the enemies of the regime were found among his fellow party members. Hundreds of Parkham members, including the Minister of Defense and the Chief of the General Staff, were accused of treason, shot, and replaced by people from Amin's circle. Karmel himself was first sent as ambassador to Czechoslovakia, and soon after was finally removed from power and forced to remain in Prague as a political exile. Thus, Amin became the de facto second-in-command in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, Taraki embarked on reforms. The first decrees seemed progressive: the cancellation of peasants' debts to moneylenders, legal equality between men and women, and the introduction of a minimum age for marriage. But then came Decree No. 8 on land reform, and it was this decree that caused a real catastrophe. Taraki decided to do what neither Daoud nor Zahir Shah had dared to do: confiscate land from large landowners. According to estimates by Soviet agricultural experts, there were about 7,000 large farms in Afghanistan, controlling more than 1 million hectares of the best agricultural land. It was logical to start the reform with these feudal lords. However, in practice, the PDPA went much further. Land was seized from 270,000 farms, the vast majority of which, about 250,000, did not belong to large landowners at all, but to middle-class farmers, i.e., the most hard-working and stable segment of the peasantry. The agrarian reform turned out to be a disaster for the PDPA. It sharply antagonized the overwhelming majority of Afghan peasants against the new government. How this looked on the ground can be traced in the example of Kunar province in the summer of 1978. A PDPA representative, who was himself a landowner, was appointed there. Using his authority, he ordered the arrest of the respected mullah and tribal elder Muhammad Sadiq, accusing him of counter-revolutionary activities. In reality, the official simply wanted to settle a long-standing land dispute in his favor and appropriate Sadiq's land. The attempted arrest sparked armed resistance from local residents who rose to defend the elder. In response, the authorities sent troops to suppress the uprising, but this only caused an even greater explosion of outrage. The entire province soon rose up in rebellion. Thus, a local conflict caused by corruption and abuses by the PDPA quickly turned into a mass armed movement. The particular danger of the situation lay in the fact that Kunar was located on the border with Pakistan. For Islamabad and the Islamic Party of Afghanistan, which it supported, this uprising was a real gift. Pakistan did not change its strategy. The replacement of the secular dictator Daoud by the communists of the PDPA did not affect its plans to overthrow the government in Kabul. Emissaries of the Islamic Party soon appeared in Kunar and began supplying the rebels with weapons and ammunition in exchange for an oath of allegiance to their movement. As a result, the border area of Afghanistan quickly turned into a transit point for Islamist troops. It was through Kunar in the spring of 1979 that Ahmad Shah Massoud and his troops crossed the border again and returned to their native Panjshir Valley, where they began a guerrilla war for the second time. And on March 12, 1979, one of Afghanistan's most influential spiritual leaders, Sibghatullah Mojadedi, who was in Pakistan at the time, issued a fatwa calling for jihad against the godless communist government in Kabul. 2 days later, on March 14, 1979, a powerful uprising broke out in the west of the country, in Herat. But this time it was not the tribes that rebelled, but an entire military unit, the 17th Infantry Division of the Afghan Army. It is this date that is considered the beginning of a full-scale civil war, which lasted in Afghanistan for more than 4 decades, until 2021. The uprising in Herat was followed by new rebellions. In April, an uprising broke out in Jalalabad among the soldiers of the 11th Division, and in August, the elite 444th Commando Regiment rose up. The reasons that pushed the military to side with the Islamists were not only religious. Of course, the fatwa on jihad was of enormous importance in a deeply religious society, but other factors also played a role. Many officers, like the peasants, came from landowning families. The PDPA's land reform hurt their interests and those of their clans. In Afghanistan, people identify themselves first and foremost with their tribe and clan. For example, they were Pashtun from the Safi tribe, and only then Afghans. The reform destroyed these traditional ties, which pushed the officers even further into opposition. We must not forget the purges carried out by Hafizullah Amin in the army. Hundreds of officers were arrested or removed, which pushed the rest to side with the Islamists. By the fall of 1979, the size of the Afghan army had collapsed catastrophically. The number of officers had decreased tenfold, and the total number of armed forces had fallen from 100,000 to about 50,000. The rest either deserted or joined the Islamic opposition. Thus, in just a year and a half of rule, the PDPA lost the main support that had brought it to power, the officer corps. The regime was rapidly collapsing. It was against this backdrop, immediately after the uprising in Herat, that President Nur Muhammad Taraki arrived in Moscow for the first time on March 20, 1979, and officially asked the Soviet leadership for direct military assistance, that is, for Soviet troops to be sent into Afghanistan. After the Politburo meeting, Leonid Brezhnev clearly stated Moscow's position in a private conversation with Nur Muhammad Taraki. He said, "Now, regarding the issue you raised in your telephone conversation with Kosygin, and then here in Moscow, concerning the introduction of Soviet troops into Afghanistan, we have carefully considered this option, discussed it thoroughly, and come to the conclusion that it should not be done." This decision was not made lightly. It was preceded by lengthy consultations with military experts and analysts. Chief of the General Staff Marshal Nikolai Garkov, his deputies, Chief of the Main Operational Directorate General Varenikov, and Head of the GRU General Vashitin unanimously warned the leadership against sending troops. Based on intelligence and a thorough analysis of the situation, they believed that the Soviet army would inevitably be drawn into a protracted civil war with no military solution. The KGB leadership shared this view. No one in Moscow wanted to openly intervene in the Afghan conflict and turn it into their own war. Nevertheless, it was decided to support the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan and the new government in other ways, by sending military advisors to the country, expanding arms supplies, and organizing the training of Afghan officers and soldiers in newly created training centers. At the same time, the possibility of conducting limited covert operations by special forces was considered. In this regard, on April 26, 1979, the General Staff issued a directive on the formation of a special unit, a separate special purpose detachment within the GRU system. Thus began the history of the legendary 154th Separate Special Forces Detachment of the GRU, created specifically for operations in Afghanistan. This detachment had a unique composition and structure for its time. Its staff numbered 532 people, more than any other special forces unit in the Soviet Army. It included 4 companies, an anti-aircraft platoon with Shilka self-propelled guns, 2 platoons of grenade launchers with AGS-17s, a flamethrower platoon, a communications platoon, an engineering platoon, a motor transport platoon, and a logistics platoon. The unit also had its own armored vehicles. One company was equipped with BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles, and 2 others were equipped with BTR-60 armored personnel carriers, which was not the case in regular special forces units. The recruitment process was also different. While other GRU special forces units, like the entire Soviet Army, recruited soldiers from among new recruits through military registration and enlistment offices, the 154th Detachment was formed exclusively from soldiers who had already served in the Army for at least 6 months. The selection was mainly made from among volunteers, and candidates had to meet strict criteria. For example, during physical training tests, they had to complete a 30-kilometer forced march within a limited time. As a result, only about 100 people were accepted out of more than 1,000 applicants. Major Khabib Kolbev, who had previously served in the 15th Special Forces Brigade of the GRU, was appointed commander of the unit. Platoon and company commanders were selected from across the country, and not necessarily from special forces units. For example, the first company was led by Senior Lieutenant Vladimir Sharapov, who had transferred from the motorized infantry. He was a candidate for Master of Sports in motocross and a Master of Sports in pistol shooting, a man who dreamed of serving in the special forces. A special feature of the unit was that its personnel were entirely made up of natives of the Central Asian republics, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. This was done deliberately. All the fighters spoke Farsi, one of the main languages of Afghanistan. This training ensured a high degree of camouflage, since in the event of the unit being transferred abroad, it was to be officially listed as part of the Afghan government army and operate covertly. Due to the characteristics of its personnel, the 154th Special Forces Unit was unofficially nicknamed the Muslim Battalion in the Army. By June 1st, its staffing was complete. In order to bring the level of training up to the highest standard, the unit was relieved of all guard and maintenance duties and immersed in an intensive 6-week training course based on a specially developed program. Unlike other GRU Special Forces units, which usually prepared for classic reconnaissance and sabotage operations behind enemy lines, the Muslim Battalion mastered other, much more ambitious tasks. The fighters practiced capturing individual buildings, airfields, mountain passes, and conducting combat operations in urban environments. Each soldier underwent parachute training and completed several real jumps. Even details such as the fastest possible arrival at the airfield and the loading of combat equipment and personnel into transport aircraft were practiced. In essence, this unit was a unique synthesis of special forces and an airborne assault unit, a permanent mobile unit with enhanced combat readiness, capable of responding to threats within hours. For several months in 1979, the Muslim Battalion could safely be called the most trained and combat-ready unit in the Soviet Army. When the training course came to an end in July 1979, there was a real possibility of it being used in Afghanistan. By that time, Afghan leader Nur Muhammad Taraki was appealing to the Kremlin almost monthly with requests to send in troops. Realizing that there was no hope for large-scale military intervention by the Soviet Union, he sought to have at least 2,000 to 3,000 Soviet soldiers sent. They were supposed to be stationed to guard government buildings in Kabul in order to free up Afghan troops to fight the opposition. Moscow refused even this step. However, Soviet intelligence had serious reasons to believe that Hafizullah Amin was preparing a coup and intended to remove Taraki and take his place. The question arose of sending the Muslim Battalion to Kabul to guard the president. The logic was simple. With Soviet troops in close proximity, Amin would not risk assassination, as the death of Soviet soldiers would inevitably lead to open conflict with the USSR. But Taraki himself once again demonstrated his weakness as a politician. Despite Brezhnev's personal warning about the impending conspiracy, he limited himself to expressing gratitude and took no action. Real power in the army and special services had long since slipped from his hands. As a result, the 154th Detachment was never sent to Afghanistan. And in September 1979, Afghan citizens learned from the newspapers about the uncovering of the conspiracy. This time, the head of state himself was portrayed as a counter-revolutionary and traitor. On October 9th, 3 officers from Amin's entourage entered the room in the presidential palace where Taraki was being held under arrest. They threw a mattress on the floor, laid him face down, pinned his arms and legs, and pressed a pillow over his head. After 15 agonizing minutes, Taraki was suffocated. Amin became the absolute ruler of Afghanistan. His first act was to assure Soviet representatives that he would continue the policy of friendship with the USSR and, as had become tradition, he again requested the introduction of Soviet troops. However, the coup made an extremely negative impression in Moscow. The Kremlin saw this as the second consecutive case in which the USSR leadership was presented with a fait accompli. "We have removed your former ally, now you will have to deal with us." Very soon, more alarming news arrived. The terror unleashed by Amin within the country was becoming increasingly brutal and uncontrolled. Repression increased with each passing day, intensifying the hatred of the population. Islamists, supported by increasingly broad masses, were stepping up their offensive. On October 31, 1979, the Politburo met again to take stock and determine further steps on the Afghan issue. The first weeks of Hafizullah Amin's rule gave no cause for optimism. Official documents and memos sent to Moscow stated that, along with ostentatious gestures such as the announcement of the start of preparations for a new constitution or the demonstrative release of some prisoners, the new leader's real policy boiled down to a sharp increase in repression. Mass arrests and reprisals swept through the party apparatus, the army, state institutions, and public organizations. Amin clearly sought to remove from the political scene all those he considered real or potential rivals, even if they had recently supported the new regime. This course of action quickly produced the opposite of the desired effect. While initially only representatives of the Parkham faction opposed Amin, they were soon joined by his former allies from the Halk faction. Officials in the state apparatus, army officers, intellectuals, and young people increasingly expressed their dissatisfaction. Instead of strengthening his power, this led to growing uncertainty on Amin's part, and he sought a way out in even harsher repressions, which ultimately narrowed the regime's social base. Soviet analysts left no doubt that such a course would lead to the rapid collapse of Amin's power. Two possible scenarios emerged for the USSR, either to intervene in some way in Afghan events, or to remain a neutral observer and watch as Islamists took over the country. Soviet leaders immediately recalled the example of 1929, when the progressive king Amanullah Khan was overthrown by the Islamic opposition. At that time, the Soviet Union did not intervene, and only after the new rulers allowed the Basmachi to raid the territory of the USSR was the Red Army forced to send in a small detachment, which could no longer change the outcome. Afghanistan plunged into chaos, and the Soviet republics of Central Asia had to fight off the Basmachi rebels who had found refuge across the border. In 1979, the scenario was frighteningly similar. At first, the Politburo hesitated. A little Soviet assistance might have saved Taraki's life and slowed the collapse of the Afghan state. But now Taraki was dead, and it seemed only a matter of time before the Islamists came to power. Even then, myths began to form in the USSR that would later be used as ideological justification for the invasion. One of the most popular was the version that Amin was allegedly a CIA agent and was going to turn Afghanistan into an ally of the US, almost ready to join NATO. This myth was invented after the fact, when the war was already in full swing. In reality, Soviet intelligence understood perfectly well that Amin had no ties to the Americans. The real threat lay elsewhere, in the rapid Islamization of the country, which threatened to spread to Soviet Central Asia. It was the prospect of the spread of jihad that frightened the Soviet leaders. Until April 1978, Afghanistan had remained a traditionally friendly state to the USSR. It seemed that nothing foreshadowed any sudden complications. But the April Revolution, which brought radicals to power, dramatically changed the picture. A potentially hostile regime appeared on the southern borders of the Soviet Union. Afghan society, although deeply religious, had not been infected by fundamentalism until that moment, and this was of paramount importance for the stability of the region. However, Amin's repressions effectively provoked the start of a holy war. Jihad spread rapidly throughout the country and put the religious factor at the top of the political agenda. Moscow increasingly feared that if Islamic fundamentalism prevailed in Afghanistan, a wave of extremism would inevitably spread to the republics of Soviet Central Asia. There was no talk of the CIA, NATO, or America in the context of Afghanistan in the 1970s. Until 1979, the United States was, in essence, completely indifferent to what was happening in this mountainous country. The real threat arose within the region. Islamic fundamentalism, nurtured and fueled by Pakistan, compounded the mistakes and gross miscalculations of the PDPA reformers, leading to the crisis. Vladimir Kryukov's opinion was shared by the legendary head of the KGB's illegal intelligence service, General Yuri Drozdov. He argued that if the USSR had not intervened in the situation, the bloody scenario we know as the civil war in Tajikistan in the 1990s would have unfolded 15 years earlier. In that case, Islamic radicals receiving support from Afghanistan could have begun to undermine Soviet Central Asia as early as the beginning of the 1980s. Of course, history does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, and we will never know what would have happened if the Soviet Union had stayed out of it at the time. Perhaps Islamists would have come to power in Kabul as early as 1980. But the fact remains, this time, Moscow decided to act. The reason for the intervention was the figure of Babrak Karmal, the leader of the moderate opposition within the PDPA, who was in exile in the USSR. He was seen as an alternative to Amin, a man whose policies could ease the situation and deprive the Islamists of their social base. Only replacing Amin with Karmal could give the progressive forces a chance to retain power in Afghanistan, but Karmal did not have his own military support. Consequently, this operation had to be carried out by the Soviet army. The Kremlin was faced with a choice: either a full-scale, long-term troop deployment with broad intervention, or a swift, limited operation to remove Amin and transfer power to Karmal, followed by a rapid withdrawal of Soviet units. The top military leadership of the USSR was initially opposed to a large-scale troop deployment. But when the political decision was finally made, Marshals Ustinov, Ogarkov, Varenikov, and others supported the second option, a quick and targeted operation. This option formed the basis of the plan codenamed Baikal 79. According to this plan, the introduction of Soviet troops into Afghanistan was to take place formally at the request of the government. After that, the units were to capture 17 key government facilities in Kabul, remove Amin, and ensure Karmal's rise to power. The 105th and 108th Motorized Rifle Divisions, which crossed the border by land, as well as airborne units, the 103rd Division and the 345th Separate Parachute Regiment, which were transported by aircraft, were involved in the operation. A crucial role was also assigned to Special Forces, the 154th Separate GRU Detachment and KGB units. The total strength of the Soviet force was about 30,000 men. Today, opinions on that decision traditionally differ. Some consider the introduction of troops to be a criminal act of aggression against a sovereign state, for which the USSR had to pay and repent. For them, the symbol remains the speech given by academician Sakharov in 1989, harsh, full of accusations and bitterness. Others, on the contrary, see that step as an act of assistance to a brotherly people, an attempt to protect Afghanistan from sliding into Islamic fundamentalism and civil war, which it later had to endure anyway. People often like to list how many facilities the USSR built, free of charge, for the Afghans. But we will return to this issue later. For now, it is important to understand that the introduction of Soviet troops cannot be viewed exclusively as aggression or as an act of unconditional assistance. To understand this, it is necessary to rely not on personal political views, but on the principle of historicism. From the point of view of international law, the introduction of troops was not an act of aggression. It took place at the official request of the Afghan government and on the basis of the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation concluded in 1978. It was an intervention in a country where a full-scale civil war was already underway. It is important to understand that the decision to send troops was neither a sudden burst of international solidarity nor a gesture of pure goodwill. It was a pragmatic step aimed primarily at ensuring the security of the southern borders of the USSR. Several decades earlier, the Soviet Union had been quite satisfied with both the monarchy and Dowd's dictatorship, even though those regimes oppressed their people. The main thing for Moscow was that the border remained peaceful. Brezhnev and Suslov were not cartoon villains, plotting attacks on their neighbors for the sake of world domination. But neither should they be romanticized. By 1979, for the Soviet leadership, the concepts of socialism and international duty had long since become official formulas that primarily concealed state pragmatism. The decision to send in troops was finalized on December 12, 1979, at a Politburo meeting, although the course of action had already been decided between late October and early December. On December 7, the 154th Separate GRU Special Forces Detachment was transferred to Bagram Air Base. The personnel were dressed in Afghan uniforms. They were to become part of the Afghan leader's security detail. But the real goal was different. The Muslim Battalion was to play a key role in Operation Baikal 79 and capture Amin's residence. By this time, Amin seriously feared for his life. And no wonder, after all, he himself had participated in the elimination of his predecessors, Dowd and Taraki. Realizing the threat, Amin refused to live in the presidential palace in Kabul, where his predecessors had been killed, and moved to the more fortified Tajbek Palace. At first glance, he welcomed the arrival of Soviet special forces to protect him. But it was Tajbek that made the future operation to eliminate him an extremely difficult task. The palace was located on a hill, from which the entire surrounding area was clearly visible and could be easily targeted. Only one winding road led to it. In addition to the palace itself, there was an entire military complex here, barracks for a security brigade of about 2,000 people. This brigade included 3 infantry battalions and 1 tank battalion armed with T-54 tanks. The facility was additionally protected by an anti-aircraft regiment with 11 20mm anti-aircraft guns and 16 DSHK machine guns. 3 tanks were buried in the ground directly outside the palace walls, and the building itself housed Amin's personal security company, about 150 of his closest and most loyal people, including relatives. The personnel of Amin's palace guard were the most motivated and reliable at his disposal. On December 13, 1979, the 154th Separate Special Forces Detachment, Muslim Battalion, marched from Bagram to the Tajbek Palace area and joined the security forces. Initially, the officers of the detachment, unaware of the real plans, were engaged in joint combat training with the Afghans, working out the organization of the palace's defense. Even the battalion commander, Major Kulbeef, did not suspect at the time that his unit would have to storm the facility rather than defend it. It was only on December 17 that Colonel Kolznik, deputy head of the GRU Special Intelligence Service, arrived in Afghanistan, the man who had been entrusted with organizing the operation. It was he who first informed the battalion command that Amin's palace was to be stormed. For most of the fighters, this remained a secret until the last moment. The main Soviet military advisors in Afghanistan at the time were Colonel General Magomedov, Ministry of Defense, and Lieutenant General Ivanov, KGB. They proposed a plan according to which the 154th Detachment was to simultaneously capture 4 key targets: the General Staff, the Kabul Airport, the State Security Building, and the Tajbek Palace. To this end, the Special Forces were divided into platoons, leaving only 1 company and 2 platoons for Amin's residence. Formally, all the officers present nodded in agreement, but in reality the plan was doomed. Colonel Kolznik, the very man who was supposed to carry out the plan, was categorically opposed to it. He stated outright that sending 1.5 companies of special forces against a fortified complex housing about 2,000 people, including a tank battalion and artillery, was pure madness. The Soviet generals considered his objections to be insubordination and reported Kolznik's behavior to the Chief of the General Staff, Marshal Ogarkov. Kolznik was summoned to a direct closed communication, and only after his personal report did Ogarkov acknowledge that he was right. As a result, it was decided to abandon the spreading of forces and concentrate them on the main task, the assault on Tajbek. Moreover, at Kolznik's request, the 9th Company of the 345th Parachute Regiment, additionally armed with Fagot anti-tank missile systems, was assigned to reinforce the unit. Kolznik calculated that the Afghans would have a clear numerical advantage, and therefore everything had to be done to prevent the 3 Guard battalions from intervening in the battle. These battalions were stationed in different military towns, and each had to be blocked by a separate Special Forces company. The 1st Battalion, stationed next to the Tank Battalion, was blocked by the 2nd Company of the Muslim Battalion. It was reinforced with AGS, 17 grenade launchers and flamethrowers to prevent the tankers from even approaching their vehicles and force them to stay in their barracks. The 2nd Battalion was blocked by the 9th Parachute Company. The 3rd Battalion was blocked by the 3rd Company of the Muslim Battalion. Particular attention was paid to the anti-aircraft regiment, which was located closest to the Soviet positions. If the Afghan crews had managed to man their guns and open direct fire, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Therefore, it was planned to suppress the regiment's positions with fire from 2 AGS-17 crews, under whose cover an engineering platoon was to break through and destroy the guns. In addition to the main forces, 3 tanks dug into the ground between the Tajbek Palace and the positions of the 3rd Afghan Battalion remained an important element of the plan. To prevent their use by Afghan tankers, 15 minutes before the start of the operation, Captain Sohatogo's group, deputy commander of the Muslim Battalion, consisting of about 15 Special Forces soldiers, was to capture these vehicles. The immediate assault on the palace was entrusted to the 1st Company of the Muslim Battalion, reinforced by a platoon from the 3rd Company. The unit moved on BMPs and BTRs along the only winding road leading to the palace. The advance was to be covered by Shilka anti-aircraft guns, which opened direct fire on the palace. It was at this position, a few days before the attack, that the famous photograph of the Shilka against the backdrop of the palace was taken. However, the advance of the armored vehicles was an extremely dangerous part of the operation. The road was narrow, winding, and exposed to fire from all sides, with a roadside mined. It was impossible to maneuver, and the column became an easy target along the half-kilometer route. All this made the advance to the palace the most vulnerable part of the plan. After reaching their positions, the task of the first company was limited to blocking the building. The immediate capture of the interior and the elimination of Amin were entrusted to another group. In the 20s of December, about 60 new Soviet servicemen arrived at the location of the 154th Detachment. They were dressed in Afghan uniforms and blended in with the special forces, arousing no suspicion among the Afghans. But on closer inspection, it became clear that these were not conscripts, but mature, silent, and experienced fighters. Their task was to break into the palace and carry out the main objective, to eliminate Amin. These men belonged to a special KGB unit, the legendary Alpha. Its history began after the tragedy at the 1972 Olympics in Munich, when the German police, lacking special forces, failed to free the hostages, and the whole world witnessed their deaths. The USSR, preparing to host the 1980 Olympics, created its own anti-terrorist group, Alpha. Initially, it consisted of only 30 people who specialized in rescuing hostages in confined spaces, buildings, buses, and airplanes, as well as in the targeted elimination of particularly dangerous criminals. Alpha's professionalism was subsequently confirmed by numerous operations, such as in 1986 in Ufa, when 2 deserters killed police officers and hijacked an airliner with 81 hostages. Alpha fighters stormed the plane in 8 seconds. 1 terrorist was killed, the other was captured, and none of the passengers or special forces were injured. It was this specific ability, the ability to quickly and accurately eliminate a specific target, that made Alpha a key element in the operation to eliminate Amin. At the same time, the GRU Special Forces Command, including Colonel Kolesnik, did not know the true purpose of these men. For most Soviet military personnel, the operation looked like an assault on the palace with the aim of changing the government. Only those 60 KGB officers who joined the Muslim Battalion knew about the real mission, the elimination of Amin. In late December, General Yuri Drozdov, head of illegal intelligence, secretly took command of the KGB Special Forces in Afghanistan and became Colonel Kolesnik's deputy in preparing for the upcoming operation. However, there were not enough Alpha fighters to carry out such a large-scale task. Therefore, in the summer of 1979, a temporary special unit called Zenit was created within the KGB. Officers who had undergone advanced training and were in reserve in case of war were selected for it. Formally, they were being trained for sabotage operations on enemy territory. Colonel Grigory Boyarinov, a veteran with extensive combat experience, including service in the NKVD sabotage units during the Great Patriotic War, was appointed commander of Zenit. He was to lead the KGB Special Forces assault. According to the plan, Alpha, 24 fighters, and Zenit, 30 fighters, were to enter Amin's palace in 2 groups, from the main entrance and from the side of the building. They carefully studied the layout of the 3-story palace, worked out routes through the rooms, and observed the guards, preparing for the attack. On December 25, 1979, at the official invitation of Amin's government, Soviet army units began to enter Afghanistan. Formally, this was the introduction of troops at the request of an allied state, and it is this date that is considered the beginning of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. Amin himself was pleased. He did not suspect that the forces that had been brought in would soon become the basis of a conspiracy against him. Operation Baikal 79 was scheduled for the evening of December 27th. On December 26th, the 9th Company of the 345th Parachute Regiment arrived at the location of the Muslim Battalion and KGB Special Forces. Now all the forces for the assault were assembled. On the same day, the unit commanders were given a table of code signals for radio communications. Among them were the following code names: Storm-333, Start of Hostilities; Hurricane 555, Approach to the Target; Calm 888, Mission Accomplished; Storm 777, Going into Battle; Silence 999, No Resistance. It was precisely because of the first signal, Storm 333, that the operation went down in history under that name. Within the KGB, Amin's elimination was codenamed Agate. On the afternoon of December 27th, an event occurred that is still shrouded in mystery. During a banquet, Amin and his guests suddenly felt unwell. The head of state himself began to lose consciousness. The Afghans turned to Soviet doctors, and soon 2 military doctors from the embassy, Colonels Alexeyev and Kuznechenkov, arrived at the palace. Many later believed that this was an attempt at poisoning by the KGB. However, the doctors, who were not privy to the plans, acted sincerely. They did everything they could to save Amin's life and pumped his stomach. There is still no accurate information about what exactly happened. The memoirs of Soviet leaders mention a version of an attempt to put him to sleep rather than to kill him. But most researchers agree that if poison was used, the goal was undoubtedly murder. Drozdov's own recollection supports this version. According to him, at 3 p.m., Yuri Andropov called him and said briefly, "I don't want to, but I have to," and then ordered him to prepare for the assault. The time of the operation was moved from 10 p.m. to 7:30 p.m., apparently after receiving a report that the poisoning had failed. The failed attempt only complicated the situation. Suspecting something was wrong, the Afghans strengthened the palace's security and increased their combat readiness. Only in the final hours before the attack were the commanders told the true nature of the mission. They were to storm the residence of Amin, who, as the fighters were told, was an American spy and imperialist puppet. It was this episode that gave rise to one of the most famous explanations of the events, which conspiracy theorists still like to recall. All participants in the assault were dressed in Afghan uniforms, and to distinguish their own, they tied white bandages around their sleeves. This improvised distinguishing mark became a tradition of the Special Forces and is still used today. According to the plan, Captain Sohati's group was to be the first to enter the battle. At 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes before the start of the operation, his unit was to move in a JZ-66 truck to 3 tanks dug in near the palace and take control of them. However, as he was driving past the location of the 3rd Afghan Battalion, Sohati noticed that personnel were assembling on the parade ground in response to an alarm. The battalion commander sensed something was wrong and decided to put his men on combat alert. This threatened to disrupt the plan to block the battalion in the barracks. Sohati made a snap decision to strip the Afghans of their command. The truck sped onto the parade ground. The Special Forces wrestled the Afghan officers to the ground, shoved them into the vehicle, and sped away. The stunned soldiers opened fire, but it was too late. The group left without casualties and headed for their main target, the tanks. The soldiers remained with the vehicle to guard the prisoners, while 2 Alpha snipers from the group advanced toward the tanks to neutralize the guards. Among them was Captain Dmitry Volkov, a master of sports in shooting. The snipers took out the guards and were joined by Sohati's fighters, ready to use the captured tanks to support the assault. But the element of surprise was lost. As soon as the Special Forces approached the vehicles, heavy fire opened up on them from the palace. A firefight broke out throughout the area. Captain Volkov was killed in the crossfire, becoming the first Alpha fighter to fall in battle and, in fact, the first Soviet soldier to die in the Afghan war. Sohati's group had to retreat. They were unable to deploy the tanks, but they prevented the Afghans from using them. This episode disrupted the original plan even before the official start of the operation. Hearing the shooting, Colonel Kolesnik immediately realized that the element of surprise had been lost and ordered the assault to begin immediately. The units hastily advanced to their targets ahead of schedule. The soldiers who attacked the Afghan anti-aircraft regiment completed their task the fastest. Under the cover of AGS-17 fire, which prevented the anti-aircraft gunners from leaving the barracks, sappers from the engineering platoon of the 154th Detachment captured the positions and blew up the guns. The paratroopers of the 9th Company had the most difficult task. They had arrived at their location just the day before and had the least time to prepare. Their task was to block the 2nd Afghan Battalion. They quickly reached their target in their armored personnel carriers, turned around on the parade ground, and opened fire to prevent any attempts by the soldiers to escape. But in their haste, they did not notice the separate battalion headquarters building. Fire was opened on the paratroopers from behind, killing 2 soldiers. The soldiers of the 9th Company quickly got their bearings and suppressed the fire from the headquarters building, blocking it. Soon, the Afghans, including the battalion commander, laid down their arms and surrendered. The firefight with the Afghans locked in the barracks continued for some time, but, left without leadership and demoralized, they also surrendered. Thus, the 2nd Afghan Battalion was completely neutralized. The company accomplished its mission, although it lost 2 soldiers that day. The largest concentration of Afghan soldiers was in the barracks of the 1st Battalion, where the tank crews were also stationed. To block them, the 2nd Company of the Muslim Battalion received serious reinforcement. In addition to the AGS-17, it was supported by 2 Shilka self-propelled guns. Their 423mm rapid-fire cannons fired directly at the target. The total firepower, up to 3,400 rounds per minute, was impressive, especially in the gathering twilight of the Afghan evening. Under such continuous fire, the Afghans were paralyzed. No one dared to stick their heads out of the windows, and the tank crews did not risk running out to their vehicles under fire. As a result, the task was successfully completed here as well, with no casualties among the Soviet Special Forces. However, the main and most dramatic events unfolded on the main front, at the Tajbek Palace, where Amin himself was located. As soon as Colonel Kolesnik gave the order to start the operation 10 to 15 minutes ahead of schedule, 2 Shilkas opened fire on the palace, as planned. There were 4 such installations in the 154th Detachment. According to the plan of the operation, the first to advance on the palace were to be the fighters of the 1st Company of the 154th Detachment in BMP-1s. They were accompanied by Alpha Special Forces. This group was given the code name Grom, Thunder. The BMPs were armed not only with machine guns but also with 73mm cannons, so as they advanced, they were to fire heavily on the building. They were followed by the Zenit Group, together with one of the platoons of the 3rd Company of the 154th Detachment in BTR-60 armored personnel carriers. This order was explained by the fact that the BTRs were inferior to the BMPs in terms of protection and firepower. But by the time the attack began, preparations were not yet complete. The Thunderfighters did not have time to take their seats in their vehicles, and in the first few minutes there was a delay. One of the Alpha officers, Sergei Kuvalin, recalled, "There was some lack of coordination. We hadn't yet managed to take our places in the BMPs. I was just closing the door when Shilka opened fire. The element of surprise was completely lost. Due to the confusion, it was not the BMPs that moved forward first, but 3 APCs from the Zenit Group. One of the 4 APCs was delayed due to engine failure and fell behind the column. By this time, the Shilkas had been firing at the palace for several minutes, but the shooting was not very accurate. It is important to remember one crucial detail. The battle took place in complete darkness. Neither the Special Forces nor their equipment had night vision devices or thermal imagers. And the palace was not defended by disoriented soldiers from the barracks, but by Amin's personal guard, his most loyal and highly trained fighters. After the poisoning incident earlier that day, they were on high alert and reacted instantly. As soon as the armored personnel carrier convoy approached the palace, it came under heavy fire. The lead armored personnel carrier was damaged but managed to pick up speed and break through to the palace building. The second armored personnel carrier following it was hit just 30 meters from the target. The Zenit fighters inside had to leave the troop compartment right in the open, under heavy fire from Amin's guards. The first to exit was the subgroup commander, Senior Lieutenant Boris Suvorov, who was killed instantly. Several of his fighters were wounded, but, acting under the cover of fire from the lead APC, the rest managed to reach the front of the building and take cover in a dead zone inaccessible to enemy fire. Meanwhile, the Afghans shifted their fire to the next column, where the BMPs of the Grom Group were traveling. The vehicles rushed at full speed towards the palace, and it was at this moment that the defenders' lack of grenade launchers and other anti-tank weapons became apparent. They could not stop the armored vehicles. But then a new threat arose. The column came under fire from their own Shilkas. One of the BMPs was hit, and its platoon commander, Abdullayev from the Muslim Battalion, was seriously wounded. Fortunately, it was possible to quickly establish communication with the Shilka crews and move their fire higher, to the second and third floors, so as not to hit their own troops. The disorderly fire, mixed with heavy shooting from the Afghans in the palace, forced the BMPs to maneuver haphazardly on the narrow platform in front of the building. Some vehicles managed to get close and drop off fighters right at the entrance, while others unloaded special forces several dozen meters away, under heavy fire. Among the attackers was Evald Kozlov, future hero of the Soviet Union and legend of the State Security Special Forces. He later recalled, "It was very important that the first vehicle stopped right at the entrance. If it had stopped earlier, there's no telling how it would have ended. The fire was terrible. I had only just stuck my foot out of the BMP when it was immediately shot through. When the Alpha team began to leave the BMP, fragmentation grenades flew from the windows of the palace. The explosion of one of them killed Captain Gennady, and several more people were wounded. In a matter of minutes, the Grom group lost 13 of its 24 members, and this happened before they even had a chance to start fighting inside the building. Another important circumstance came into play here. Amin's guards were armed with MP-5 submachine guns, while the Soviet Special Forces stormed the building wearing helmets and body armor. Despite the heavy fire, the MP-5's penetrating power was lower than that of the AK-74, and personal protective equipment saved many from fatal injuries. That is why, even when wounded, most of the fighters were able to continue fighting. Due to the chaos and loss of the initial order, the Special Forces entered the palace as best they could, through the main entrance, side doors, or even through windows. The sequence of subgroups became mixed up. The first floor was quickly taken. The Afghans preferred to secure their position higher up, on the second floor, from where they fired downwards. The first attempt to climb up was unsuccessful. Paradoxically, one of the first on the stairs was not a Special Forces soldier, but a translator from the first Chief Directorate of the KGB, Senior Lieutenant Andrei Yakushev. It was his turn to go up first, but a grenade thrown from above exploded at his feet. Yakushev died on the spot. He was followed by Valery Yamashev, commander of the Alpha subgroup. The explosion tore off his right hand. He later mastered a prosthesis and continued his service, rising to the rank of colonel. While the KGB Special Forces were fighting on the first floor, the soldiers of the 154th Detachment blocked the palace from the outside, cutting off the escape routes. Their task was not only to prevent Amin from escaping, but also to repel attempts by his garrison from the nearby headquarters and security company to break through to his aid. In these clashes, the 1st Company of the 154th Detachment lost 1 soldier killed, and several dozen more, including Company Commander Vladimir Sharapov, were wounded. The same task was performed by a platoon of the 3rd Company under the command of Lieutenant Tursungulov. The GRU fighters were given strict orders not to enter the palace. However, despite all the setbacks and critical circumstances, the assault on Amin's residence went down in history as exemplary. It showed how professional special forces can operate in conditions where the initial plan collapses and the situation requires instant adaptation. No operation, even one that has been perfectly planned, ever goes exactly according to plan. Operation Storm-333 was born as a protest against the disastrous plans of the armchair generals, and at the most tense moment, its officers decided to change the plan without consulting their superiors. This is the true quality of a commander, the ability to take responsibility. Colonel Grigory Boyarinov, who led the assault and was in the thick of the battle on the first floor, quickly realized that without the support of the GRU fighters, the building could not be taken. He began shouting through the windows, ordering Tursungulov to bring his platoon inside. The lieutenant heard him but hesitated. The day before, Generals Drozdov and Kolznik had strictly forbidden the Muslim battalion from entering the palace. Then Boyarinov, risking his life, ran outside under crossfire to personally bring in reinforcements. He was killed in front of Tursungulov, most likely by friendly fire. The colonel was wearing an Afghan uniform, and the special forces had orders to shoot anyone who left the palace. The white bandage that served as an identification mark could have gone unnoticed in the chaos of the night battle. Official sources prefer to remain silent about this version, but it was Colonel Boyarinov's sacrifice that turned the tide of battle. For his actions, he was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. After his death, Lieutenant Tursungulov led his platoon inside without hesitation. The commander of the Zenit Group, Yakov Semenov, took charge of organizing the assault on the second floor. Now, with the support of the GRU, the fighters were finally able to act in unison. The confusion of the first few minutes gave way to the precise work of the special forces, and further losses were minimized. Before storming the second floor, the special forces fired a volley from Muka grenade launchers, after which they methodically cleared each room, first with grenades, then with small arms fire. Amin's guards hardly surrendered, but they were unable to inflict serious damage on the attackers. About 10 guards were captured, while more than 100 were killed. The ratio of losses was overwhelming, at least 110 in favor of the Soviet Special Forces. When the 5 Alpha fighters led by Viktor Karpykhin, future hero of the Soviet Union, approached Amin's quarters, Alexander Plusnin took the decisive step. He kicked down the door, threw a grenade inside, and burst in first. Amin was already dead in the room. Plusnin's grenade put an end to the story of yet another Afghan ruler. The main task was accomplished. After Amin's elimination, the remaining Afghan troops began to surrender en masse. By the morning of December 28th, more than 1,700 people had been taken prisoner. Only in some places did skirmishes flare up during the night, killing several fighters from the Muslim battalion. A tragic episode of the operation was that, along with Amin, one of the Soviet doctors, Viktor Kuznechenkov, was killed as a result of a failed attempt to poison him. In parallel with the storming of the Tajbek Palace, operations were carried out as part of the Baikal 79 plan to capture key facilities. The Bagram Air Base, the buildings of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the General Staff, and the Kabul Television and Radio Center. The Zenit Special Forces groups and Airborne Forces units played a leading role in these episodes. All tasks were completed with minimal losses within a few hours. As soon as confirmation of Amin's elimination arrived, a pre-recorded address by Babrak Karmal was broadcast from the captured television and radio center, announcing the overthrow of the tyrant and the coming to power of progressive forces. Operation Baikal 79 was a success. Its main result was the capture of the Tajbek Palace and the elimination of Amin. Soviet losses amounted to 14 killed, 5 KGB Special Forces officers, 7 soldiers from the 154th Separate GRU Special Forces Detachment, and 2 paratroopers from the 9th Company. 35 KGB officers and 67 GRU Special Forces soldiers were wounded. There are occasional references to 9 paratroopers killed, but 7 of them were from other units of the 345th Regiment and died during the capture of targets in Kabul and Bagram, not in the palace. There is also a version that some of the GRU Special Forces died on December 28th from friendly fire from paratroopers, but documents and memoirs indicate that they died on December 27th, the day of the assault. Thus, some details of the operation remain unclear to this day. The Soviet leadership highly praised the special operation. Its success prompted the creation of a permanent elite KGB Special Forces unit, Vimpel, based on the temporary Zenit detachment, with Ewald Kozlov, a participant in the assault, as its first commander. The operation showed that a small but highly trained Special Forces group was capable of achieving results of historic significance with a single strike. Storm-333 is rightly considered a classic special operation. At that time, there were simply no other examples in history of such a successful elimination of a political leader by special forces. Similar attempts had been made before, but they often ended in failure. In 1941, British commandos unsuccessfully attempted to eliminate General Erwin Rommel. The operation ended in disaster. In 1968, Israeli forces launched a large-scale raid against a fortified Palestinian base where Yasser Arafat was hiding. The operation was similar to the future Storm-333, with the base being blockaded and army units providing fire support. However, Arafat was never captured. The striking force of the Israeli operation against Arafat's base in 1968 was the Sayeret Matkal Special Forces, an elite unit that could be called the Israeli equivalent of Alpha. But the operation did not go according to plan and resulted in a 15-hour fierce battle with the Palestinians. In the end, Arafat managed to escape, and the Israelis lost 33 people killed. Today, in the era of the War on Terror, when we have witnessed dozens of special operations by various countries, such events seem commonplace. But in 1979, the Soviet Special Forces had nothing to compare themselves to in terms of successful operations of this scale. That is why Storm-333 remains a classic. It was the first truly successful operation of its kind. It is no coincidence that NATO soldiers later considered it an honor to be photographed in front of the Tajbek Palace. However, the illusion of quick success proved short-lived. Initially, Moscow hoped that after the victory of Operation Baikal 79, Soviet troops could be withdrawn soon. But reality proved otherwise. The new Afghan leader Babrak Karmal was no different from his predecessors, Taraki or Amin. His supporters immediately began mass reprisals against the Hawkists, accusing them of ties to the former regime. Karmal himself proved to be a weak leader, lacking charisma and political will. He saw the expansion of the Soviet military presence as the only means of retaining power. He did everything he could to draw Moscow into active combat against the rebels. The Soviet political leadership gave in, and instead of withdrawing, it began to build up its contingent. As a result, the number of Soviet troops in Afghanistan tripled. The army found itself drawn into the very war that the military had initially warned against. And, as history shows, such wars, started by politicians against the advice of professionals, inevitably end in disaster. The USSR spared no expense in supporting the PDPA regime and developing the Afghan economy. The Afghans received significantly more than they later did under NATO. But political failure was inevitable. The PDPA party turned out to be a thoroughly corrupt, clan-based, and weak structure, unable to compete with the Islamists for the support of the people. In this respect, the Soviet project of the 1980s was no different from the American project of the 2000s. The war continued. The Muslim Battalion, which played a key role in the storming of Amin's palace, returned to the USSR in early January 1980. The unit was soon disbanded, but a new detachment was formed under the same name and sent back to Afghanistan. Early in the war, the Soviet command clearly recognized Pakistan's leading role in supporting the Afghan Islamists. Soon, the U.S. joined the Pakistanis. To stop the constant flow of weapons and fighters across the Afghan-Pakistani border, a special plan called Curtain was developed. It provided for the large-scale deployment of additional GRU Special Forces units in Afghanistan, which were to block mountain trails and destroy caravans carrying weapons.